most Republican donors who tend to be cosmopolitan and don't want to hear about LGBT causes or contempt for trans people or abortion issues even, and who are starting to become uncomfortable with Governor DeSantis for his refusal to criticize Trump as harshly as they want to, are looking for an alternative. And yet you see the people who are thriving and who are attracting attention, like Vivek Ramaswamy, who we interviewed as part of our trip to Milwaukee last week. You can watch that interview if you haven't already. It was a very interesting interview. We interviewed him the day after his performance in that presidential primary. Shows that the people who are attracting support are people with this anti-establishment mindset, or at least claim to have the anti-establishment mindset that Trump personified and gave voice to. And it seems as though the alternative that a lot of these establishment Republicans and neocons are now placing their hopes in is former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley, in part because she did have a very strong performance at the debate. I was there. I watched it. I heard the applause from the Republican donor base, who are situated right behind the Fox News microphones, and the entire center stage of the floor of the debate is reserved for the Republican Party. Rumble was a sponsor of the debate, or at least had exclusive rights to stream it online. So we had very, very good seats. Because I was part of the Rumble contingent, I sat right behind people like Donald Trump Jr., and Marjorie Taylor Greene, and Matt Gaetz, and other people of that kind who were also there as part of Rumble. They all have shows on Rumble. But the real seats, the best seats, are all reserved for Republican Party donors, for establishment donors, to ensure that the people whose cheering and booing you're hearing most are Republican establishment donors. Now, there are also people on the sides who are huge fans of Vivek or Governor DeSantis, and he has a lot of support among establishment voters as well. So you hear from them too. It's not entirely that, but they ensure that a huge part of how the debate is shaped is through the reaction of establishment voices. That was what Donald Trump pointed out in 2016 when he was being booed by the audience in the Republican debate for criticizing Jeb Bush, somebody who had no support among most Republicans. And yet you would have thought Jeb Bush was the most honored and revered figure in the world based on the audience reaction, because, as Trump pointed out, the audience was filled with Republican lobbyists and Republican donors who were backing Jeb Bush and who hated Donald Trump. Now, one of the ways Nikki Haley tried to distinguish herself, I think her most dramatic and effective moment, was when she clashed with Vivek Ramaswamy and specifically stood up to defend Joe Biden's signature foreign policy, which is U.S. support for the war in Ukraine against Russia. Now, I think it's extremely weird that somebody would run for the Republican presidential nomination when it seems like the signature of their campaign is agreement with the signature foreign policy views of the other party's incumbent president. Usually, if you're somebody who really supports the foreign policy of the Democratic Party, go be like the Bill Kristol and David Frum and almost every other neocon in the United States and go join the Democratic Party or support Joe Biden's candidacy like most of them are doing. Why run and be Joe Biden's opponent only to agree with him on core foreign policy and even economic policy issues and only have mild clashes on the culture war? Yet that seems to be exactly what Nikki Haley is doing. So here's the clip of her in the debate where she clashed with Vivek, specifically on the war in Ukraine and foreign policy generally.
Of Governor DeSantis that you didn't appreciate it when he initially called it a territorial dispute. Why?
First of all, the American president needs to have moral clarity. They need to know the difference between right and wrong. They need to know the difference between good and evil. Right. When you look at the situation with Russia and Ukraine, here you have a pro-American country that was invaded by a thug. So when you want to talk about what has been given to Ukraine, less than 3.5% of our defense budget has been given to Ukraine.
Okay, just to be clear, the United States spends more on its military budget than the next 14 nations combined. And in fact, it spends even larger than the $850 billion figure that we're given. When you add on to that the budget for the intelligence agencies, it's probably closer to $1.5 trillion. So when you're talking about 3.5% of the defense budget, you're talking about an enormous sum of money. In fact, just to give you one example, in 2016, the Obama administration, with the Republican Congress, signed a deal with Israel, a 10-year deal, to provide Israel with what the New York Times just this week called a vast sum of money, $38 billion in American money that is transferred to Israel each year for 10 years based on the view that Israel is an important ally in the Middle East and therefore we have to support it. You know those arguments. Nikki Haley is a big believer in that. In just the first 18 months of the war in Ukraine, the Biden administration and the Congress under it, the bipartisan Congress, has authorized more than what the United States devoted to Israel for that 10-year package. That was a record-setting package that Netanyahu, despite his differences with Obama, was genuinely grateful for. It's unprecedented in terms of the amount of support that one country gives to another. And that's because of this special relationship that both parties insist on supporting between Israel and the U.S. Now, just this week, in fact, today, President Zelensky said he wants and expects the United States to have the same relationship with Ukraine that it has with Israel, namely that it provides Ukraine with all the money that it needs to maintain a sophisticated and advanced military, and that it isn't dependent on which party wins. So Americans can't vote against it. Just like you can't vote against aid to Israel because they'll get it if Democrats or Republicans win. Zelensky wants that kind of guarantee from the United States as well. And so Nikki Haley's trying to say that 3.5% of our budget, our military budget, is a tiny amount. At the same time, she wants to cut Social Security and Medicaid and make Americans have to work longer and harder to be eligible for those benefits, to devote more of their life to their pointless jobs, because now she doesn't need Social Security and Medicare, nor do her children, because she's enriched herself with millions and millions of dollars of personal wealth by serving the very corporate and militaristic interests that are now financing this campaign so that she goes on stage and says these things.